Hello and good evening, everyone. I'm Lauren Christensen, School Board Vice President.
And I'm Patrick Keogh, School Board Treasurer.
And I'm Patty McCoy, a school board trustee.
So this is our webinar that we're doing, Money Matters, a school finance webinar for community members. We're going to try to make this as entertaining as we can for what's oftentimes a dry subject, and we may have set the expectations a little high with our invitation, but we'll do our best as we go through this process. In this agenda and the process that we're going to talk about here is we're going to start with some of the common misconceptions, the things that people have often heard about and thought about how education is funded. And then we're going to talk specifically about things, how we are funded as a district, including operating funds, as well as capital funding and the difference between those. We'll talk about how this relates to the annual budget process, which we're just starting right now. We'll share some of the district priorities and the dynamic plan and how those influence the budget and the work that we do, and then how you can get involved, how you can participate in this process and provide your input into the work that we're doing. So when we start, one of the first common misconceptions that we hear about often is my property tax are the things that are funding schools. And as my property taxes go up, the schools should be getting more money. And we'll explain why that's not entirely true in this webinar.
Another misconception is that the lottery is funding the schools. And while lottery money does go into the mix to fund schools, it's not extra money as it was originally intended to be. So while there is some lottery, which we'll get into, it's not a main source of income.
Now, the next one here about sales tax funding schools is actually quite true. The sales tax is one of the largest contributors to the school fund process, and we'll show how that breaks down.
Another common misconception is that every district gets the same funding. Now, we're going to go into a little bit about the background behind Proposal A and the goals there, but this is not necessarily a true statement, and we'll tell you a little bit more why.
And while the federal government provides a lot of support for special education, it doesn't directly fund schools and the work that we're doing. And lastly, we want to talk about one of the things that we have about the bond or the millage that we passed in 2020 and the misconception that maybe that is the basis for how schools are funded. And we just voted for all that money, so why are you having struggles being able to support the things that you do? So we'll start in this process about how we're funded, and we'll talk about the two different areas of things that we're doing. Operating sources, these are the things that happen on the regular annual budget process, and this includes the salaries and the benefits, transportation, operations and maintenance, things like our custodial and our building repairs and maintenance, and supplies and materials, things like textbooks and other things as part of that. And then we'll also talk about the capital sources. That's where that millage and those bonds come in, and they can be used for big things like additions and renovations and other things like technology and buses, but can't be used for anything else. So we'll start with the operating funds and how we got started in this process. Back in the olden days, 1787 all the way through 1993, the Constitution of the US and the states are the things that governed how education was funded here in Michigan. And all education was 100% locally controlled, especially, and the local funding is part of that. And what predominantly drove that was the property values and the property taxes. And what that meant is that the schools had unequal funding, and you had property owners having unaffordable taxes in many places. And a big event happened in Kalkaska, the county up near Traverse City, in February of 1993. They completely ran out of money in February. They had no money to support their schools, and they completely closed because their citizens had not renewed a millage that was part of there or not voted for that millage, and it meant that they didn't have the money that they needed to run the school that year. And that was really an untenable process. Enter Proposal A. Proposal A of 1994, this is from the House Fiscal Agency, what they described what Proposal A was supposed to do. It was a constitutional amendment initiated by the legislature, and it was designed along with some statutory changes for some specific goals. They wanted to reduce the school operating property taxes. They wanted to reduce the reliance on property taxes and the inequities that cause to fund schools made it so that the state shared the support of schools on a broad basis instead of having this be done at a largely a local level, to provide a guaranteed minimum per pupil funding level. And that their intention was to provide more equity in school district per pupil revenues. What they really were doing, though, was providing more equality. And we'll talk about this in the future, about other things, about the difference between equity and equality. But even with the equality perspective, it didn't quite work out the way we wanted. So the main source of revenue for this is what's called the school aid fund. And the school aid fund provides the majority of the funding for the district, and that certain taxes, like some of the things in the lottery, et cetera, are deposited into the school aid fund to pay for operations. The state constitution requires that the school aid fund is only used for schools, higher education, and school employee retirement benefits. At one point, I believe that the state or the school aid fund was really only used for schools, but at some point in between 1994 and now, more of that money was diverted towards higher education as part of that process, reducing the share that was available for traditional public schools. If we look at the school aid fund, this is where you can see that breakdown of how the different taxes come in and how they go into that. And sales tax is that largest source of revenue, more than 43% of the process. But you see individual income tax funding the school aid fund, the state income tax, which is a portion of your property tax that goes in there on residential properties. You see the lottery transfer goes into there, use taxes, real estate transfer taxes, what's called sin taxes with tobacco and gambling and other things that are all part of that process. They all go into the mix, and it's a huge mix that goes into a pretty substantial amount of money, almost $18 million that goes into this process, and that was for for this current school year. But if we look at how this breaks down to a district like P-CCS, this comes down to what's called the per pupil funding amount. And that per pupil funding amount is $9,150 per pupil. Now, there's a little bit of problems that we have in managing the budget process. Is because school districts have a fiscal year that goes from July 1st to June 30th, and we must publish a budget by June 30th. But the state has got an October 30th budget year. So they don't have to publish their budget until then. And oftentimes that means that the districts are creating their budget using information that's not entirely accurate. So for example, in P-CCS, we originally projected that our per pupil funding was going to be $91.35, but it actually turned out to be $91.50. And that extra $15 is great when you look at that across more than 16,000 students. But if we look at how that money is divided out, $144 million comes from state sources, $33 million comes from those local sources, and I'll cover those in just a second. The intermediate sources, this is the Wayne County Intermediate School District, and that's $10 million. And then some very small money that comes from federal sources and others. Now, there are other federal sources that go into special education funding, but those are generally reimbursements against the costs that we have. And so it's not a huge portion of our budget. So when we look at the foundation allowance, if we start here and we look at this graph, this is where we started back in 1995. This graph up here at the top line, this was considered what was supposed to be the minimum. But what we saw was many schools were not at the minimum. They were, this was supposed to be the maximum, the target amount that they were trying to get to. And then they created another target there that said, okay, we're going to try to get everybody up to this maximum, the state guaranteed one, by trying to raise this money over the years as part of that process. And then you had a number of schools that were still at this minimum process. So everything's going along pretty well. They're kind of moving these things up as this line goes through. And then they moved the target up to the maximum. And this left these other schools, including P-CCS, substantially below. And they also dramatically dropped the revenues that we had back in 2011, 2012, when we had the recession at that time, and that caused a substantial change in the process. Only in the last 2 years have they closed the gap where they brought the minimum, the target, and the maximum together, where all schools are getting $91.50.
So this shows a foundation allowance. And you notice at the top, it says the School Research Collaborative estimated the base cost was $10,421 per pupil. That is a general education student who is not taking a bus to school, not preschool, no special services, no CTE, none of those things. That is to provide the bare minimum education that's been mandated by the state. So you can see that even with the 9150 for P-CCS this year, we are $1,300 below that. And so when you times that by the 16,000 students, you can see where those gaps are.
It's almost $20 million is the difference that we'd have in that process. It's a substantial amount of money that could go into our schools if we were funded at the level that the State Research Collaborative said is the amount that's necessary to provide an adequate education, not a great education, an adequate education. So when we look at this and we think about, well, where do property taxes fit into this? And property taxes are an important part of the state and local funding mix. I mentioned at the original graph that the state education tax, or the SET, is levied at 6 mills on residential properties. This means that as a resident, you're going to have 6 mills of your taxes that are going to go towards the education process. But districts also levy 18 mills on all non-homestead properties. The thing that's a little bit challenging with us on this, and these non-homestead properties are commercial properties and anything that's not your primary residence. So it could be a vacation home or anything like that that you might have, or a rental property, is the state calculates the local revenue on those 18 mills. They make the assumption that all of those 18 mills are being levied on all the non-homestead property, and the state deducts that money from the foundation allowance that we get. So if we collected $20 million or $50 million in local revenue, that money is going to be subtracted from the foundation allowance that we get from the state. And this becomes particularly important every 10 years because we have to renew that non-homestead property tax. Now, we're not going to get into the details of the Headley rollback processes and everything else, but this is why districts like P-CCS oftentimes levy more than 18 mills, so that we can, if there is a rollback in that property tax rate, we can keep that at the 18 mills and make sure that we have that, because the state will be deducting 18 mills regardless of whether we pass that millage or not. Now, there's another part of this process that certain districts were held harmless. These were districts that are above the state guaranteed maximum, and that they're able to, by law, to levy additional mills in their local property tax environment. P-CCS is not part of that. Districts also can have a situation where they levy so much non-homestead properties that they're able to keep all of that money, and then the state doesn't receive a share at all. But none of these things apply to P-CCS. So what is hold harmless, and why does that matter to us? It is a certain thing that happens to a very small number of districts, 39 districts that are currently held harmless. These are districts that back in 1994, they had a choice to become a hold harmless district because they wanted to be able to levy more local mills than Proposal A would allow them to do. And at that time, Plymouth Canton was a really rapidly growing school district with the expansion and the build out of Canton. And they made the choice not to. So our electors chose not to do that. But this really kind of put P-CCS at a disadvantage against those 39 districts. The highest of those 39 districts gets $12,985 as compared to our $9,150, almost $4,000 more than what P-CCS is getting in this process. And that's a substantial difference in that environment. And the struggle with this is that hold harmless rule, although it has to be renewed every 10 years, there's no chance for other districts to be included. So there's no opportunity for P-CCS to say, hey, we want to levy additional mills to better support our schools. We do have an opportunity to do that through intermediate sources. So Wayne County Regional Educational Services Agency, or RESA, is the intermediate school district for Wayne County, and it includes P-CCS. RESA does distribute money to the district that comes from special education funds. There's a special education millage that you'll see on your property taxes that helps to fund some of the special education work that we do. And we get about $4 million from that. But post Proposal A, the only way that school districts can levy additional local millages for operating costs is through that intermediate district enhancement millage. And you may have seen this process because we just did a renewal on that. But the regional enhancement millage is something that's been brought up a couple of times before. It was defeated in 2015, but then in 2016, a 2 mil enhancement millage was passed, and it provided at that time about $6.5 million in additional funds to what we call traditional public schools. That means non-charters as part of the process. But the law changed, and when we renewed the enhancement millage in 2020, it meant that the traditional public schools as well as charters had to share in that money as part of that process, and it reduced the amount of money that P-CCS got to about 5.9 million. And we really appreciate that money. It's made a huge difference in the services and the work that we can provide for our students, but it is something that is not close to closing the gap that we would get if we were actually funded the way the Michigan Research School Collaborative would say. So one of the questions that we saw that came in preparation for this webinar is, what about the ESSER funds? And they're really complicated. The good news is that the federal government and then through the state provided a lot of relief funds during COVID. And based upon last year, which is the latest time that we've got the information completed here, there was 7 different funds that we had as part of this process. Starting with the coronavirus release funds and then different ESSER funds that were done. And we spent all of that money as part of this process. Each of these ESSER funds had specific timelines and dates of when you had to spend the money and the kinds of things that you could use to spend those on. In just a second, we'll show more of the details on that. So we've made some good progress on some of these things, and ESSER 23B, 2A, and 2B, those were completed last year, and we're now working on ESSER 311T. And if we talk a little bit about some of the things that we did.
So much of the money was used to help support our students, understanding that the pandemic caused a lot of some interrupted learning. Also, children were not able to maybe engage as well because it affected some children more than others. So some of the money was used, virtual academy teachers and interventionists to address learning loss for children who were not comfortable going back into the building. Class sizes were reduced to make sure that we were able to distance appropriately in the classrooms. Middle schools got deans to support and some additional counselors and behavior specialists. The district paid for and launched Panorama, which is a great platform that allows you to track the students and be able to have monitoring that if children are having some issues, you can quickly see them and then start to address them. There was a learning management system that was put into place and is still being used. The summer programming and high school credit recovery, one summer it was completely cost-free for all of our families. And then teachers on special assignment, which provide some remediation and some help in some classrooms. And then a diversity, equity, and inclusion climate and culture specialist were also here to support our students in our classrooms and our teachers.
A bulk of the funding, the ESSER funds, were also used for keeping our environment healthy and safe through enhanced HVAC filters, air purifiers and filters, and a lot of PPE, personal protection supplies, as well as additional healthcare technicians during that time and cleaning assistants.
So as we move from operating costs into capital revenue, this is the money that the local millages do have an impact on. And this is the bond that we were able to do as part of this. So local millages can be used for infrastructure spending. And there's specific things that we can do as part of this process. Proposal A allowed districts to raise money to support those physical infrastructure components, and you can use that for land acquisition, new buildings, renovations, athletic facilities, buses, and technology. You can't use it for repairs. So if you're trying to do a renovation in the school, that's fine. But if you're trying to repair something that went wrong, that's not included. So if you have to patch a roof that's leaking, it generally can't be used. But if you're replacing a roof, it can. Districts can also levy sinking fund millages for up to 3 mills. Sinking fund is a term that's used to be able to support a pay-as-you-go model for being able to do building renovations, technology infrastructures, and school security upgrades. This is not something the P-CCS currently does right now. We have gone out with a more traditional bond in this process, but as that bond and the projects get completed, we may look to a sinking fund to be able to help. And as the mills go down, we may look to a sinking fund to be able to provide a safety net to allow us to support some of those other renovations and infrastructure upgrades that we would do through a traditional bond, but this gives us a little bit more flexibility and reduces the borrowing cost of that to the community as part of that. So nothing right now, but you might see it in future presentations when we talk about how this work comes in. The big thing that we wanted to call out is that bond money, although it's very much appreciated and the support from the community has made a huge difference in the projects that we've done, it can't be used at all for operating costs. It can't be used to pay teacher salaries or supplies or anything else that happens that's considered an operating cost. It can only be used for those very specific purposes.
So the focus of the bond was kind of three-pronged. It was to provide equity among the buildings, give us a competitive advantage among other districts in a school of choice era and the many options, and then also fiscal responsibility. So we do appreciate the community supporting the schools, and we wanted to make sure we were not raising the taxes. So can we move to the next? So there was a 10-year master plan that was done. So every building was walked and a huge binder was created to make sure that the priority for the schools was warm, safe, dry, to make sure that all of the schools had the basics. So our students need safety and security. We needed to upgrade all of our facilities, even the newer ones, equity of programs within our district facilities, technology and infrastructure upgrades, because we have 21st century learners, we need to have 21st century infrastructure. Come up with some innovative programming that's part of our competitive advantage with other districts. Grow our program offerings, flexibility for our expansions, classroom furniture, and that is so important to have our students being able to focus and fully engage when they are comfortable and they have some options in their classrooms, and just to really make sure we're keeping up with other districts and providing the things that our families and learners all need at this point. So we went out in March 10th of 2020 after spending over a year deciding what was actually necessary. Our list of wants was much greater than the $275 million that the bond proposal was. So there were facility and site improvements addressing equity. So some of you may be aware that older elementary schools had a gym / cafeteria, which meant that it had to be emptied for lunchtime and then set back up after lunchtime, which affected the entire school schedule as far as when you could or could not use the gym. So that's an example. Also, a baseline of equipment, inclusive equipment for our playgrounds, so all of our learners can enjoy their time outdoors. Enhancing the safety and security. There were a couple buildings that did not have the secure entrances because they needed a lot of work due to their layouts. And again, the furniture, school bus purchases. We're able to purchase some school buses to keep our fleet running appropriately. And then infrastructure and technology needs at most of them. It was a 0 increase to the annual debt rate, which is below or at 4.02. And this touched every building in the district. And there is on our webpage, the bond 2020, where you can actually see the ongoing work and what we've all done.
Yeah, and the bond program itself stretches over multiple years, and we have broken these projects down into smaller chunks. So what we're showing here is what we're calling bid package EL1. It's the first series of elementary schools. It was Dodson, Erickson, Field, and Holsing. Just as Patty had mentioned, a lot of these upgrades to these buildings had to do with secure entrances, collaborative spaces, upgraded lighting. Furniture was a really key part of that, but the new gymnasiums as well. Here at Dodson, you can see some examples of the finished projects here. Here's the inclusive playground. We have our classroom addition, and then the media center. Similarly, at Erickson Elementary, we're showing the finished project. It's so exciting to see these polished images. It's been a process, I will say. So we have the gymnasium, the art room, and then we have our secure entrance, and then our media center with some alternative furnishings for students. Similarly, at Field Elementary, we've got our inclusive or accessible playground equipment, as well as our secure entrance, and then our cafeteria. And lastly, we have Holsing with our secure entry. We're showing that on the exterior of the building. I love this image here of the playground. It feels like we're actually on the equipment, so you can experience it from that vantage point, as well as art classroom with the high ceilings and a lot of natural light. Another package that is completed is the high school Salem Auditorium addition and renovation. So this is a scene shop and dressing room addition to our auditorium. You can see the exterior of the building where that new before and after has occurred. And here's the interior, the before of the Salem Auditorium. After, you can see it's gotten a little bit of a facelift. It's light, bright, airy. It has some improved acoustics, all new audience seating. Accessibility was a big part of this project. So there was a wheelchair lift that was installed to allow a wheelchair-bound person to either access the orchestra pit below or the stage above. And here's some great images of the kind of behind that auditorium space, that addition component. So we have the dressing room and the scene shop. So EL2, this is a bid package that is currently underway, and this is a series of 3 elementary schools, so Bird, Miller, and Smith. As Patty had mentioned, in the 2013 bond, some of the buildings did get secure entrances, but this is tacking on. Our 2020 bond is continuing to advance that mission, and Miller is one of the schools in this package that will receive a secure entrance, but all 3 schools will have new playground equipment, have that really separate cafeteria and gym component, as well as the other similar renovations to the first bid package. And here you can see the construction progress over at Bird. We have the gymnasium, and then we have an image of the interior of the art classroom. Miller, you can see our secure entrance on the exterior there. Looks like we have our new welcome desk and the art classroom here. Last, we have Smith Elementary, so the construction progress on site, showing the new gym and art rooms. So it's so exciting. There's all these projects kind of going on at once. So at our high school bid package 2 is the Plymouth Pool and Multi-Purpose Room Edition. So this is a brand new natatorium at Plymouth High School, as well as a multi-purpose room.
And we call it a natatorium because it's not just a swimming pool. It includes the bleachers and everything else. So we all learned a fancy word going through this bond process. So when we think about this, how does all this impact the budget? What do all these things come in? The capital projects don't impact the regular school budget that we're doing. Those capital projects are all things that we planned across the 10-year period of time, and we're working through those things as part of that work. And for all of those capital projects, they go through the Finance and Operations Committee meeting where there's public input as part of that. They go through at least 2 readings as part of our normal school board process. So if you want to get visibility into those things, look at the Bond 2020 page on the district site. You can see in progress presentations every Tuesday, what we call Bond Tuesday, that talks about the work and the projects that are happening there that are under construction. And you can also hear and read about some of the upcoming projects that are happening as part of that. When we do all of these projects, we also provide lots of input from both the teachers and the staff at each of the schools, the community members and the families, but also the students. They all go into that process to help us drive the work that we do on those capital projects. But the things that we do from an operating budget really are the things that drive the year-to-year, day-to-day processes that happen in the district. So we'll talk about the district operating budget and what goes into that. So when we look at the operating budget, this is specifically based upon the budget that we passed for this current school year and where we were spending the money as part of that process. So this was our general fund expenditures for function for as of June 30th. So it's actually last school year. I'm sorry, I misspoke. What you see here is that instructional and instructional support is the bulk of that money. 73% of our money almost 74% of the money is going towards the work that we do directly in the classrooms. We have maintenance and operation, and that includes things like the heating and the air conditioning, the custodial services, and the other things that are part of that. The transportation is the buses and the maintenance on those buses. When we look at this category of general business and central support, this is central office, but mostly this is the money that's happening in support services at the schools, things like the principals and the other things that are part of that process. Any of the people processes that we do that are not part of providing direct instruction support for students shows in that category. The activities and athletics is a small portion of our overall budget. It's sometimes smaller than what you'd see for surrounding districts, but it is something that we make the best use of as part of the work that we're doing. We have small amount of monies that we do for community services and debt service on here. And the debt services is particularly small because the district has maintained really strong foundational, fund balance processes and has been able to refinance some of those debts to get a lower interest rate, which saves the community money as part of this process. However, when we reorganize those funds, we look at the same time period and we say, let's look at these things from a different lens. If we look at these from the lens of how we're spending them, the object type, salary and fringe benefits is really the largest portion of the work that we do in the district. More than 83% is the things that go into that. Those purchase services are the things that we're using for outsourcing, including transportation and custodial services that are part of that. Those supplies and materials are the textbooks, but also the other things that we need to purchase as part of that. There is still some money that's spent on capital outlay and equipment. So these are things that are not permitted by the bond, perhaps repairs and things like that, where we've had to replace an air conditioning system. That's where that money comes in as part of that process. And then we've got a small portion that's for other expenditures. So when we think about all this, a lot of these things come in there's a lot of things that we have to consider when we're building the budget process that goes into this. So if we look at the timing for all this that budget process starts with what the state calls the CREC, or the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference. This is where the state legislature gets together with the governor and they make a look forward as to what the budget process is going to be and how much money they expect to be coming in at the state level for next year. And they use that information to help inform how they're going to adjust the school aid funds and the other money that they may provide to districts as part of this process. We are participating in this activity through the community survey. Originally, we put this community survey out from February 14th to February 24th to give people a chance to provide their input on the investments or the cost savings that they thought could be made against the budget process. And we definitely value and appreciate that community input. Because of the delay in this webinar, we've extended that survey for the community to March 5th. From there, we present some basic budget assumptions to the Finance and Operations Committee. We review the survey results. We review the finalized budget assumptions. And the assumptions are really, what do we expect to happen with the number of students that will be in the district? What do we expect to happen based upon the CREC? What are the things that are going to go into that process? And that goes first to the Finance and Operations Committee and then presented to the full board on March 14th. Both the Finance and Operations Committee meetings as well as the Board of Education meetings are public meetings. So there's an opportunity for the community to see what's coming up in that process and to weigh in. From there, it really begins the budget transformation process. And this is a holistic process that the district drives, largely led by the administration and the leaders of the district at all levels, where they take those budget assumptions, what they think is going to happen from revenue, and then they essentially decide what are the gives and takes, what are the things that they want to invest in, what things worked well for them as part of the process and they want to continue doing, where do they want to make additional investments, or what things maybe didn't work out the way they expected, and they think they can adjust those things and remove them from the budget. Opportunities for cost savings or to change programs and processes to be able to better serve students in the community and the work that they're doing. That process of transformation then results into a draft proposed budget before the F&O committee on the 4th, May 4th, and then presented to the Board of Education on May 9th. We then do the preparation for a formal public hearing on that budget. That is presented on June 13th, where the community gets a chance to hear officially what is the proposed budget as part of that process. If everybody's been doing their job through all this work and we've taken all that input into this, this is really just a chance to present that final budget, and then we do that final discussion and vote on the budget before January 30th and have an approved budget that's then sent to the state by June 30th as part of this process. God, heaven forbid it's not January. So we wanted to share some of the things that we've heard from the governor that have come out of the CREC and what their recommendation is.
Yeah, so earlier this month, or excuse me, it's already March. So this was last month, the governor's recommendation was announced. And as Patrick had mentioned, so the CREC gives us a little bit of a heads up, so to speak, as to what might be a part of this budget. What we've learned, this is sort of the highlights of her budget, that this is really the highest per student funding that we've seen yet, which is, something to be celebrated. It's about $458 per pupil, which roughly is about $9,608 per full-time equivalent student. This is still below the School Research Collaborative recommendation for $10,421 to adequately educate our students. However, it is more than what we receive now, so we're certainly grateful. Part of this process too is, once the governor has announced her budget, now the two branches of the House and the Senate are going to react to this and then create another budget. We build our assumptions based on all of this information. Continuing though to highlight some of the components in the budget that was released on February 7th, there's an area of free breakfast and lunch, making sure that our students are not coming to school hungry and so that they can focus and be engaged in their learning. There's some funds behind mental health and school safety resources, and some bolstering of literacy supports from cradle to career. There's also a portion of the budget that's really targeting the teacher pipeline. So there's this My Future Educator Fellowship. So putting 2,200 Michiganders on a tuition-free path to the classroom, really trying to target, creating that teacher pipeline, because we know we have that shortage and we want to try to mitigate that gap. Student teacher stipends, again, giving stipends to set students on that path for full-time teaching, and then added teacher supports too. So the mentorships, really focusing on rural teacher workforce development and initiatives to attract talent.
So the district has what we call our P-CCS dynamic plan, and it runs from 2021 to 2027. And so this is really our master plan that is going to help guide the district over the next several years. And it is a living document that we review on a regular basis. It is also something that we are tying everything back into: our expenditures, our instruction. All of our resources are going to be tied to coming up with this. So the first thing that the board did as a whole, our team of 8 with Dr. Merritt, was we came up with what our themes were going to be. So we had 4 big pillars. So we had equity and inclusion, grounded in social justice and anti-racism, where we want all students to have what they need to be successful and feel safe, respected, valued, and represented. Community engagement and partnerships, and of course the community engagement includes families. We wanted, as a partner, the community is involved, informed, and engaged in the student experience at P-CCS. Having student-centered learning experiences is really important to let our students guide where they need to get to in their, college, career, future life. So students are at the forefront of decisions, culture, teaching, and learning. And if you come to any of the board or committee meetings, you'll see that often the presentations are calling out when the student voice is being included as to what kind of input they've had. And then also a leader in educational innovation. Again, that competitive advantage. So P-CCS is recognized nationally as a positive disruptor for student learning and growth. Now that was what the board did. We set these themes. Then the district convened an entire committee, which included administrators, teachers, parents, other community members, and a couple of board members to set the goals for this. And P-CCS will increase achievement for all students and close the achievement gaps. Students and staff will report that they feel physically, psychologically, and emotionally safe and represented, because children who don't feel represented or safe are not going to engage well. We will increase, enhance, and sustain community partnerships to improve student outcomes. And this has been, it's amazing to learn how many things we actually offer. And then we will incorporate student voice and input throughout the educational process. So when you're looking at the bond work and the furniture purchases and the playgrounds, those have all been driven by some student input. And so things have changed based on what students have reported in the buildings where they've started some of these piloting. And then we will be recognized as a leader and innovator for student learning and growth. So when you come to the board meetings, what you might notice is that all of the presentations now are tied into this dynamic plan. So each department has come up with their strategies and their goals and their targeted ideas, and they tie them into this because that's how we're going to spend all of our resources going forward, achieving the goals that we've set for our district.
So when we think about the investment lens for this next school year in the beginning of the budget process, we don't have full details on this because this is things that are very much dependent upon what comes in from that budget survey and the transformation process that the community does, as well as the budget hearings that happen with the board. But some of the things that we're doing specifically around the ESSER funds, we had to file and provide feedback to the government in order to say how those funds will be used. So the remainder portion of the ESSER funds, the Section 11T, for the second year will include things like continuing the teachers on special assignments at all 3 levels. And this is specifically to provide academic supports, and high dosage tutoring. One of the things that we saw coming out of COVID is that we really had a strong need to help our students to be able to address some of those learning losses. And these TOSAs, or teachers on special assignments, has been one of the areas that has really driven some great improvements in that process and providing the individualized support for specific students, as well as to provide assistance across the district. We'll also continue to do work on our summer programming and use those resources to help facilitate and support that additional work that we're doing there. More English language certified instructional staff. So this is one of the areas that's really been a big boon for us, is as we've brought in English language learners, we've seen the test scores for those groups actually improve. And so this has been an area that we are adding additional support to help make sure that that can continue and that we can drive that process. We've also brought in some elementary teacher consultants. So these are people that help the teachers and give them some of the assistance that they need in developing their curriculum and their content and helping them in their classrooms. We're going to continue to fund that diversity, equity, and inclusion culture specialists. And we're also providing more before and after school supports to support students that either need that additional support and activities in that process. So we will have more details coming in as we look at the budget assumptions and as we go through the budget process. But there are opportunities and places that you can help. The first and foremost is continue to support local legislators that prioritize public education. We're really, really lucky in Plymouth Canton in that all of our legislatures at the state house and state senate level are huge supporters of public education. But you can tell your friends and your family and other people that you know throughout the state to continue to vote for legislators that prioritize that educational funding. We believe that it's possible to get us to the point that we are meeting that school research collaborative funding level and really help to go beyond that in supporting both our teachers as well as our students to be able to maximize what we're doing from an education perspective. We also ask that you continue to support the local ballot initiatives that you see for education funding. We won't have another bond up for quite a while, but you may see a bond renewal a non-homestead millage renewal come up. And we want to make sure that that can continue to be supported, because if you don't, those 18 mills just come off because the state assumes that we're going to levy those things. And it's a massive reduction in our cost as part of that process. And you can also participate in the budget process. You can provide feedback on what's important to you, and that community survey that we have is a way for you to be able to do that as part of the process. And we've actually extended this to March 5th, not March 3rd. So it is open through Sunday evening. And this is the link for that. This link is also available in the email that was sent out as part of this webinar. So from there, I think we had some questions that came in that we wanted to cover. So if there's any, I know that some have been pre-submitted, Patty and Lauren, and that we may have some additional ones here.
I'm not seeing any new ones.
Okay.
So one of the questions, which I believe that you've covered, is given that recently there's been a lot of home construction in the Plymouth Canton School District and the associated increased tax revenue, why are the parents asked to chip in for things like field trips and other things? Why can't increased tax revenues be apportioned for funding school programs?
Unfortunately, the state controls that process. While the taxes are levied in Michigan, at the local level, the majority of that money is all sent to the state. And for the piece that isn't sent from the state deducts that from our revenue that we get. We're what sometimes is referred to as a donor district. We raise more money in property taxes than we actually get back from the state from that same process.
Then we recognize that we receive less money as compared to neighboring districts, and the history behind this. What are the proactive measures we can take as individuals in the community, as well as a district, to encourage state legislators to address this issue?
So I mentioned that already. Continue to support our existing legislators because they're huge supporters of public education. But most importantly, tell your friends in other communities and your family in other communities to vote for people that support public education, and write to your existing legislators and say, hey, we want you to be able to recognize the work that comes from the School Research Collaborative. We want to make sure that public education is funded at an adequate or better level.
Will funding be?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to read the next question. Will funding be cut for my child's education?
We don't believe so. What we've seen in the feedback that's coming from both the governor as well as from the state and Senate, it all looks like it's going to be another year of strong support for public education.
This is one that was not covered. What are the financial implications and perhaps consequences of the presence of so many charter schools within our district's boundaries?
So charter schools are competitive with traditional public schools, and we welcome that competition. But charter schools play in a somewhat unlevel playing field. They don't have a publicly elected school board. They don't have a level of transparency. And one of the biggest things is they are not required to provide transportation. So it creates a really inequitable scenario for those parents that maybe can afford to transport their students. Those schools can capture that additional revenue as part of the process. We have more than $7 million that our district spends to provide transportation, and we think this is a really wise investment for the work that we're doing to support all students and making sure that they can get a great education. We welcome the competition from charter schools. We think that P-CCS is the best school district, and you'll continue to see great work that we're doing on publishing what we're doing, but we do wish that there was a more level playing field around that process.
And then is there a district-wide campus master plan that outlines that illustrates existing and anticipated facilities necessary to accommodate the new world of learning? Is the campus master plan integrated and aligned with the district's academic and strategic plans? Is this campus master plan sufficiently funded, or do we need to rely on millages or special elections?
So Patty, you're probably in a better position than anybody to answer that based upon some of the work that you've done on the bond program and the equity or the dynamic plan.
So our dynamic plan is what we use as our master plan for how we're going to spend our money. The bond, when you go out for a bond, you have to say what you're going to spend it on. So you can't just ask for the money and then spend it on other things. There is, however, a little bit of leeway in the idea that as we go forward, the buildings are still looked at to see if those needs are still the same. And if they're not, those items will be cut and used for something else. So having the facilities looked at is an ongoing thing, because as you get facilities age, things have to be replaced. So that's an ongoing thing. And, we have some really good people in our district. Finance and the operations are on top of all of these things. And so they continually monitor and prioritize what we need to spend it on. So our bond funded what we felt we needed to have to provide a sufficient education. Would we like more money? Yes, but we also don't want to burden our taxpayers. So we will be continuing to look at that and updating as we need to.
And we just recently made some investments, for example, to support that innovation in education. We're replacing all of the touchscreen display monitors that exist at all the elementary schools, and those are going to be replaced over the next few years to make sure that we support the educational process and bring them up to the latest technology. And we continue to make those investments in all kinds of areas. And one of the strategic pillars that Patty also talked about is innovation. This is a really important area for both the administration and for the district, is for us to be recognized as an innovative school district. So that's very much in line with what we do, and a focus of what we're doing as a budget process.
I think that's about the end of the questions. There's a couple pretty specific ones that we have some contact information on that we could get back to them individually.
Great.
And nothing new came in.
Okay.
Yep, I'm seeing the same thing. Nothing new.
So for our community, for the people that are watching, we know that there's a lot of information that we presented today, and we hope that we provided at least some clarity around the process. This is education funding in Michigan is very complicated, and it is something that there's never quite enough money to go around. But I think that P-CCS has always shown that we are great stewards of the public money and that we deliver a fantastic education, especially considering we're at the lowest end of that per pupil funding process. So we're not a hold harmless district, but we deliver incredibly great education as part of this process, and we will continue to do so. But we do look forward to a day when we get some additional resources to be able to help us do big things like lower class sizes or be able to make some of the other investments.
Well said, Patrick. I would just like to add, this was a great overview of how schools are financed. We hope to, be a part of other webinars where we can dive deeper into some of these more specific topics.
And if you have ideas of things that you'd want to hear about or to learn about, please let us know. We'd welcome a chance to share this information with you, or even come to any of the community groups to share the same information.
Absolutely. And also make sure you're filling out the survey for the budget process.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. And I want to thank Nick and Carly for helping to put this thing on. And of course, very importantly, Debbie Piaz, the Director of Finance and Operations, that has been instrumental in making sure that all the information that we shared here today was accurate and correct, and really leading the district through the budget process. And then, of course, our Superintendent of the Year, Monica Merritt, who just recently had a fantastic news story today about Echo, our new safety and security dog that we have, that was on channel.
It was
2
on
today.
Fox 2. Yep.
Fox 2. Thank you. So thanks, everybody, and thanks for tuning in. Hopefully we'll do more of these same things, or similar type things. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We'd like to thank everyone for joining and remind everybody that this archived video will be available as long as there is a YouTube on the official P-CCS YouTube channel and can be watched anytime. Thank you so much for joining.